Okay, so here we are again in the next video. I want to discuss the concept of soft power, which, for those who aren't familiar, is a concept from the political scientist, American political scientist, I believe he's American, Joseph Nye, which basically means convincing. In other words, hard power would be military power, diplomatic sanctions, etc., and soft power would be convincing your other countries that that they should do what you want. And this, he says, is done through cultural influence, if they like your culture. In other words, like people like American. America is a brand name, so to speak. It is represented by Hollywood, by MTV, by by Wall Street, by all sorts of different American brand names. And people they admire, Soviet gymnasts defecting to America, right? Because America was a great brand name, represented great values. So culture is one way. Another way, he says, is foreign policy. If they view your foreign policy as benevolent, then they will go along with you. Or if your political system, right? Many Arabs, although not in front of cameras, envy Israel's democracy, where people can critique the Israeli government, and no one will kill them for it. So again, yeah. So the strengths and weaknesses of our global calling cards, Israel and India. Okay, so let's begin. So I believe, I hope I'm not insulting anyone when I'm saying this, but I believe both countries have weak hard power, or at least weaker than it should be. And there are a few reasons for this. The first is bureaucratic interference. This is not only in India. You do not have a monopoly on license Raj. We have bureaucratic interference here, albeit in India it is much greater, I must say this, than in Israel. But yes, we have bureaucratic interference, both for reasons of incompetence and for ideological reasons. Bureaucrats who are trying to sabotage government policy because they do not agree with it ideologically. Another thing is institutional corruption. Corruption can come in different forms. In Israel, again, I would say this is controversial. Only the Israeli right would agree. All of the Israeli right would agree with this, and relatively few on the Israeli left would agree with this. But I would say institutional corruption in Israel is mainly the overreach of the Israeli legal system, which many people would agree. Again, all of the Israeli right and some of the Israeli left, that it does political, so to speak, assassinations of prominent politicians who it doesn't like by concocting legal charges against them. And of course the aggressiveness of Aharon Barak's reforms in the Supreme Court. Again, this I can surely say is a very controversial topic in Israel. So that is one form of institutional corruption. Another form, which of course is more prevalent in India, is bribery. Again, I'm sure this happens in different places in Israel, most probably in the municipalities, but in India, of course, it is more prevalent. Just outright bribery, and of course, interest groups. There are interest groups like again of 1,000,001 forms of interest groups that can get what they want, even through corruption, through means that are either completely illegal or not completely good, even if they are legal. But again, there are different ways that interest groups can get what they want, and against the best interests of the government and the vast majority of the people. So these are different reasons. Again, in Israel, there are different groups that work. For instance, some of them go under the rubric of human rights, but they gang up on Israel and they collaborate with anti-Semitic movements in the UN Human Rights Council. Again, so different interest groups work against Israel or against India in the international scene. I think it is one should be very careful before calling out traitors. But I do not think, again, many Israelis would view this as a controversial stance, but I do not think the word traitor is a word that cannot be used. There are people who are traitors, even if nowadays we do not hang them on trees anymore. But again, I think the word traitor is a legitimate accusation if there are real charges, and not only charges of espionage, such as Azmi Bishara, the Israeli parliamentarian who ran away to Qatar. Okay, and another reason for the weakness of hard power is, and this is an even deeper reason, is what I call a slave mentality and the inferiority complex towards the West. This is a very prominent mentality along with assimilated Jews in the diaspora, and many Israelis. Again, this is a very controversial claim. Most Israelis do not like the talk of self-hatred. Again, most Israeli leftists do not like the talk of self-hatred, do not like talking about this issue. On my podcast, I work on a podcast called with Dr. Ro'i Yosevich. We did some English language interviews. We had interviewed Noam Chomsky, who the Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Evan had declared a self-hating Jew. And we asked him the question, do you believe that there is such a thing? Okay, whether you are a self-hater, we're not discussing that, we respect you, but do you believe there is such a thing as Jewish self-hatred? We know that there were Jews who collaborated with the worst enemies of Judaism, if it's communist Russia, or even Nazi Germany. Do you believe there is such a category of self-hatred? And he said, no, there is such a thing as self-hatred. You can't judge people who are in difficult circumstances, etc. Okay, so I personally believe that there is such a thing as a slave mentality, where you feel a deep inferiority towards Western dominance, etc. Jews in the diaspora, many of them hold this mentality. And even in Israel, there are many elites, Israeli elites, who view themselves as subservient to Western elites. One can think of again, I'm being a bit controversial here, but one can think of the awe that Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, has for the journalists at New York Times, who, it must be said from the outset, are obviously less educated on Middle Eastern matters than Israeli journalists. Thomas Friedman, again, is a classic example, but of someone who has predicted wrong again and again the things that go on in the Middle East. But again, this is a deep cultural issue of, again, we do not want to be anti-Western like, violent elements in the third world. But on the other hand, I do not think it is proper. You have an identity of your own. You cannot be a slave of the West either. That is a bad psychological disposition to be in, and I think it is prevalent among many elites in Israel. I understand, of course, there are similar problems in India. This is for Indians themselves to work out, but I must say that, as I said beforehand, we must be careful before calling people traitors and, brown sahibs, etc. But again, I think there comes a point where people have to realize that you have your own culture, and we do not have to follow suit. We don't have to take diktats from the West or from anyone, for that matter, from Arabs, from anyone. We don't have to. We have our own culture. We respect other cultures, but we will do as we please. Another thing is, as I said, lack of vision. Once you do not have a coherent understanding of what your own culture stands for and what your own strengths are, you will lack vision. You will not be able to have a clear vision of what your realistic goals are and how to achieve them. And of course, the last reason is powerful enemies. It should be stated immediately that Israel is not a superpower. I mean, as I believe, as vibrant a culture as we are, or we have objectively very powerful enemies against us. If these are radical Islamic elements within radical Islamic governments like Qatar, who are fabulously rich, or if they are anti-Semitic elements within European society, which might be very polite about their anti-Semitism, but they are anti-Semitic. I can point out different projects of the German government. I believe this is correct to point out that many of their cultural collaborations with Israel, basically they collaborate with, for instance, the film industry. They collaborate with only with elements who are critical of Israel and love Germany. So they will portray films. One can think of many such films in which Germany is portrayed as a lovely, enlightened culture, and Israel, the Israeli society, is something dark and horrible that Germany has to save us from our own savagery. And many German, for instance, I may point out that the German establishment refuses. I don't think they state this explicitly, but yes, they will never collaborate with anyone right-wing in Israel. For some reason, the Israeli government overlooks this, but right-wing intellectuals and cultural agents, etc., are basically excommunicated. The German establishments in Israel, if it's the Goethe Institute, will have nothing to do with them. Okay, so we have objectively powerful enemies of different kinds. So, going from the more negative to the more positive, what are the strong elements of Israeli soft power? What are our selling points to other nations? One is, I would say, Israeli values, which I would, again, the way I formulate it, would be biblical values. what is called in America Judeo-Christian. These would be biblical morality, even though, again, Christianity and Judaism are not synonymous. They have diverging interests. But yes, it should be said that American Christianity, in many forms, is based upon a more return to what they call the Old Testament, what we would call the Jewish Bible. And yes, it has a connection to Judaism. And for those who aren't familiar, Israel has very strong ties to evangelical elements who are our most staunch supporters in the West. I know in India we don't really get along with the evangelicals, but I have to say this, it is the truth. And yes, so another Israeli value that I'd like to bring up is tradition and modernity. In other words, as I said in previous videos, Israel is a country that is both traditional and modern. We have not given up on any single side of the equation. And this is very attractive. It should be said in Muslim societies. In Muslim societies that struggle how to bridge between their tradition and Islamic tradition and local tradition and modernity, Israel can be and should be a very potent inspiration on how it can be done. A country can be both, have Nobel Prize winners in science, and some of them are religious. If it's Yisrael Uman, the economics Nobelist, who's a religious Jew, etc. So this is also, I believe, it is a selling point that has not been capitalized yet enough on a society that has been able, in various degrees, to balance out between tradition and modernity. Another selling point is the Zionist story of national revival against all odds. Again, we know of how influential the book Exodus from Leon Uris has been in India, how so many people were inspired by the tale of a nation coming from exile and servitude and attaining independence and prominence again. Another part of the Zionist story is, of course, the military victories. Israel as a strong, proud military power against the Arabs. And the Mossad, the fame or even fear that it instills in our enemies throughout all enemy countries. These are Zionist selling points. And the more light elements, I would say the culture. Recently, Israel has seen some brilliant success in the field of television. If it is Netflix series like Shtisel and, of course, Fauda, which was even more successful. Fauda, I believe, was the third most watched series in its time in Lebanon, which is, of course, an enemy country. So, yes, it had a following. It had a large following. Water tech, agri-tech, which are prominent in India, cleaning up the Ganga and the Yamuna, etc. Television, music, Israeli music. Again, I think our folk music is good. Our classical music, we have great Eastern classical music, Arab music, Persian music, Andalusian music, but I personally don't like the pop music. If I must say, it's on a personal note. But the question again must be asked. The culture, as I brought up beforehand, some of these cultural projects are problematic. Again, it is first of all, there's a question what they actually represent that is Jewish, that is Israeli. Fauda, for instance. Fauda might speak of the Israeli army, but could the same series been done with, any other army, French army, American army? Could it be done like Homeland? Again, Homeland, the American award-winning series, was based on an Israeli series. I forgot what it was called in Hebrew. Chatufim, it was called in Hebrew. And again, they transplanted it from the Israeli army to the American army and the CIA. So is there anything really Israeli about that? Does it really represent some of the deep classical Jewish values that we talked about in the first video? I would say many times not. Again, Shtisel is an interesting case because there was definitely something Jewish about it, even though it was a comedy, a fantasy, etc. There was definitely something Jewish about it because the main characters were ultra-Orthodox, even if though they were a very fanciful version of ultra-Orthodox, but the dilemmas were a bit more traditional, shall we say. And as I stated beforehand, the even darker question is when there are cultural projects that are defamatory of Israel. I would bring up the project that I believe it was on Apple TV called Our Boys. It was beyond being anti-Israel and adopting basically a Hamas narrative. It was an outrageous distortion of the facts for whoever was familiar with it, and they actually manipulated the families of the Israeli victims of the story. If one followed the Israeli news, how the creators, Yosef Cedar and I forgot the other one named something Levy, made the series. It was extremely manipulative, and again, at the bottom line, this was a series made by Israelis, funded by Americans, and it was completely anti-Israeli from beginning to end, and it espoused the viewpoint of our enemies. So again, there are issues what to speak about culture. I personally think that culture is a very important factor. And in India, for instance, of course, there is much more on the cultural scene that is pro-Indian and, like patriotic, so to speak. Again, I don't think patriotism is everything. I think there are deeper values, deeper cultural values than just nationalism and patriotism, but I think patriotism is something laudable also. Okay, and here we go to the strengths of Indian soft power. Global brand names that are famous, globally. If it's Indian spirituality, again, we can ask if Indian pop gurus today actually represent the deeper aspects of Indian spirituality. Again, this should be asked about yoga, whether yoga is, yoga we know in Indian tradition is a deep spiritual exercise. It's not just about getting muscles in your stomach. So, so again, there's Indian spirituality, which can be compared to Kabbalah, to Jewish spirituality, which again, I personally, I know Kabbalists here in Israel, real Kabbalists, and I believe that the Kabbalah Center, which is an American brand run by American Jews, I believe it is a corruption of Kabbalah. But again, it is a brand name, it is a global brand name, and once people get interested in the corrupt forms, they can actually transit from there to the more authentic forms of Kabbalah. The brand name, of course, of Gandhi, whatever our political thoughts are, whatever our thoughts are about Gandhi's politics, he is a global brand name and inspiration to millions. Bollywood, of course, is a powerhouse of films. Ravi Shankar, just as a brand name of Indian music that is famous in the West. But of course, Indian music is a classical music, is a classical genre, and it has a large following. Again, even if not a completely global following, very few people in France are like enthusiastic followers of Indian music. But those who know what it is, like myself, there is a following. It has a global following. Ravi Shankar and Anushka Shankar, of course, are brand names. Indian food, which is, of course, one of the great kitchens of the world, this is recognized globally. Even, of course, Indian food, again, what qualifies as Indian food? Most people it's basically Punjabi food. But okay, different brands of Indian food. Trekking in India, yes, the Indian trekking experience in the Himalaya, etc. IIT and prominent Silicon Valley CEOs. We know the CEOs of Google, Twitter, NVIDIA, and Microsoft, Satya Nadella, are all Indian IIT. I believe they are all IIT graduates. And this is a brand name. People in the most powerful circles of high tech know what the IIT is, and they look up to Indian talent in these fields. And the question is asked about all these brand names: how are they politically capitalized? In other words, okay, people know about Gandhi, but again, this is a basic question of soft power. How does it translate into actual power? I mean, if people know about Satya Nadella, the Indian CEO, what does that actually do for India, other than just fame and fortune? Having a good name, of course, is very important. But again, the question is, what does Satya Nadella? How does he serve India? How should he serve India? Again, he is not a diplomat. He's a multinational CEO. But again, how does this translate? Does Satya Nadella go and make research and development plans in India, etc.? Okay, so these are the issues of soft power we have touched, and here we are heading for the last video.